Welcome to Heartbreak Chronicles. Late fall rain in Boston always comes unexpectedly. Victor stood under the awning in front of the company building, looking out over the street at the traffic and the pedestrians hurrying along, and he took a deep breath, feeling the vague pain coming from the scar on his chest. He had stood in the rain that same way that rainy night 2 years ago, only there was no awning around him, only a cold brick wall and water all over the floor and his own blood. The cell phone rang. Victor looked over, and it was his assistant, Mia. "Everything's set," Mia said on the other end of the line. "Elise will be starting her shift at the Rusty Anchor Bar at 3 o'clock this afternoon." "Thanks, Mia." Victor's voice was calm and unruffled. "Anything else?" "The Mitchell Consortium acquisition papers are ready for your signature. The bar is waiting for you in the conference room." Victor hung up the phone, his deep eyes staring off into the distance. Today was a special day. It was the final step in the revenge he had been planning for 2 years. Elise Freeman, once Elise Reynolds, his ex-wife and heir to the Mitchell family business. Once she was regal and elegant, from a prestigious family, and now she was serving trays in that seedy bar, the one that had almost been his grave 2 years ago. Victor raised his hand to look at his watch. The hands of the Patek Philippe showed that it was now 1:30 p.m. It's time to head to the conference room. As he stepped into the elevator, he remembered that rainy night, when Alexander, Elise's lover, puts a knife against his ribs. Victor can smell the heavy odor of alcohol and cheap cologne on him. Alexander was a middle manager at Mitchell Enterprises, Victor's internal competitor. Because of Victor's ability and experience, he became Mr. Mitchell's hand-picked successor over Alexander, who came from a family of many. This jealousy ultimately led to the seduction of his wife and the night that nearly killed him. When sirens sounded in the distance, Alexander panicked and fled, leaving Victor lying in the mud of the alley, blood pouring from a wound in his chest. He saw Elise standing at the mouth of the alley. She had supposedly followed Alexander and witnessed it all. "Elise," he called his wife's name weakly. Elise hesitated and approached slowly, but without the slightest hint of worry or remorse in her eyes. "If I don't die tonight," Victor whispered with the last of his strength, "I'll suffocate you with regret, you wicked witch." Then there was darkness, infinite darkness. The elevator reaches the top floor, and Victor walks into the conference room. 12 attorneys and financial advisors rose to greet him, their expressions serious and respectful. "Mr. Reynolds," said Thompson, the lead attorney, "all the documents are ready. Once you sign this purchase agreement, the Mitchell family businesses will officially belong to the Reynolds Group." Victor sat at the main seat of the long table, looking at the papers laid out in front of him. This wasn't just a purchase agreement. This was his response to Elise and Alexander's betrayal, to the knife that was plunged into his chest. "Does Mr. Mitchell know who the buyer is?" Victor asked. Thompson shook his head. "As per your instructions, we used a shell company for the acquisition. All Mr. Mitchell knows is that a company called Phoenix Ventures bought them. He doesn't know that the actual person behind it is you." Victor smiled slightly, picked up a pen, and signed his name to the document. The sound of a pen tip scratching across paper was especially clear in the quiet conference room. At that moment, the once glorious Mitchell family business, a business empire that had been passed down for 5 generations, officially changed hands. Victor stood up and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The rain had stopped, and the sun shone through the clouds on the streets of Boston. 2 years ago, he woke up in the hospital with doctors telling him he'd lost so much blood that it was nearly impossible for him to survive. But he survived, with a scar on his chest and determination in his heart. At that time, he lost everything: his wife, his position, his honor. Elise sued him for domestic violence, which cost him his position at Mitchell Enterprises. She got all the property, and he got nothing, just a small apartment and a few savings. But Victor Reynolds is not one to give up easily. He refounded his own consulting firm focused on restructuring troubled businesses. With the contacts and experience he gained at Mitchell Enterprises, he quickly got on his feet. At the same time, he begins to gather information about Elise and Alexander. He discovers that in the months following his death, Alexander has quickly risen to become a senior executive at Mitchell Enterprises, while Elise lives a life of luxury. But the good times don't last long. Alexander's management skills are nowhere near as good as Victor's, and under his leadership, Mitchell Enterprises begins to go downhill. loss of major customers, falling stock prices, and increased debt. Elise's lavish lifestyle exacerbated the financial crisis, and the situation worsened after Mr. Mitchell Sr. died of a sudden heart attack last winter. Victor saw an opportunity. Through careful planning, he used different shell companies to gradually acquire the shares and debts of Mitchell Enterprises. At the same time, he arranged for false investment advice to be given to Alexander, causing him to lose a lot of money in the stock market. In the end, Alexander had to sell his shares to pay off his debts, and these shares ended up in Victor's hands. As Mitchell Enterprises' share price continues to fall, more shareholders are opting to sell their shares. Victor's shell companies continued to be acquired until today, when he finally held enough shares to control the entire company. After the meeting, Victor leaves the company building, where his driver is already waiting at the door. "Go to the Rusty Anchor Bar," he said to the driver. As the car drove through the streets of Boston, Victor looked out the window at the ever-changing scenery. He thought back to his first date with Elise, at a small cafe on the banks of the Charles River. Elise had a bright smile and a twinkle of intelligence in her eyes. They fell in love, got married, and lived together for 5 years. Until Alexander came along. Located on a corner in Boston's South End, the Rusty Anchor Bar has a shabby exterior and only half of the neon sign at the door is working. Most of the customers are workers from nearby factories and disillusioned alcoholics. Victor never thought Elise would work in a place like this. He pushed open the door to the bar, and the air inside smelled of beer and sweat. A few patrons sat lazily at the bar, staring at the TV on the wall, showing a baseball game. Victor chose a table in the corner, from which he could see the entire bar. He ordered a whiskey and waited. At exactly 3 p.m., Elise came in through the back door, wearing the bar's uniform, a white shirt and black skirt. Her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and the makeup on her face was much lighter than it had been in the past. But even so, she was still the most beautiful woman in the bar. Victor watched her bustle around the bar, serving drinks to customers and clearing tables. Her movements were mechanical and tired, and there was none of the old gleam in her eyes. He wondered if she ever regretted her choice. When Elise approached his table, she hadn't recognized him. After all, 2 years is enough to change a person, especially after experiencing life and death. Victor's hair was mingled with a few strands of silver. The lines of his face were more resolute, and the gentleness in his eyes had been replaced by coldness. "What can I get for you?" Elise asked, her eyes falling to her notepad without looking at his face. "It's been a long time, Elise," Victor said calmly. Elise jerked her head up, her eyes widening from shock. Her face instantly turned pale, and her lips trembled slightly. "Victor," her voice was almost a whisper. "I see you remember me," Victor said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Have a seat, and let's talk." Elise hesitated, then carefully sat down in the chair across from her. Her hands twisted together nervously. "I thought you had left Boston." "Leave? Why did you leave?" "This is my home," Victor said as he took a soft sip of his whiskey. "And I'm curious, where is Alexander? I've heard he no longer works for Mitchell Enterprises." Elise's eyes flickered, avoiding his gaze. "I don't know. We broke up in." She paused, shortly after it happened. "Things." Victor's voice held a hint of sarcasm. "You mean the thing where he tried to kill me?" Elise lowered her head and didn't answer. "Look at you, Elise," Victor continued. "The pride of the Mitchell family, now serving plates in a place like this. It's ironic, isn't it? Did you come here just to laugh at me?" Elise looked up suddenly, a spark of anger in her eyes. "No, I'm here to tell you a message," Victor said as he removed a document from his inner pocket and placed it on the table. "Today, I acquired Mitchell Enterprises. Your family business belongs to me now." Elise's expression went from anger to shock, then fear. "This can't be." "Very likely," Victor said as he pushed the file away so she could see what was on it. "Effective today, Mitchell Enterprises will be merged into the Reynolds Group. The new company will retain the Mitchell brand, but will have a new management team and direction." Elise flipped through the papers, her face growing pale. "What?" she finally asked, her voice quivering. "Do you really need to ask that question?" Victor asked rhetorically. 2 years ago, you and Alexander plotted to kill me, and then you took everything from me by falsely accusing me of domestic violence. Today, I'm just taking back what's mine. I didn't plot to kill you," Elise agitatedly said. "That was a decision Alexander made alone. I didn't know he would. It doesn't matter, Victor interrupted. It's the consequences that matter. You are now suffering the consequences of your choices. Elise's eyes glistened with tears. I've lost everything, Victor. My family, my life, my dignity. And now you're going to take away the last pieces of the family business? Victor looked at her coldly. You had a chance to have it all. You chose to betray, and now you choose to suffer the consequences. That's what makes fate just. He stood up and put down $100 bill as a tip. By the way, Alexander now lives in a subway station. Northeast corner of South Station, if you're looking for him. He lost all his money and is now an alcoholic. You guys are a match made in heaven. Victor didn't look back as he left the bar. He could feel Elise's gaze stabbing him in the back, but it was exactly the effect he wanted. He wanted desperation and fear in her gaze, just as it had been in his eyes when he had looked up at her 2 years ago as he lay in a pool of blood. For the past 2 years, he'd meticulously planned every step of the way for this moment, to see her devastated expression, to tell her in person that he'd taken everything from her, including her last hope. The driver is already waiting outside. Back to the office, Victor ordered, getting into the limo. The car pulls away from Rusty Anchor, and Victor looks out the window. The rain began to fall again, and the sound of the raindrops hitting the car windows sounded like some kind of triumphant drumbeat, a vengeful rhythm. A cold smile emerged from the corner of his mouth. On the rainy night that almost became his grave, Victor vowed to Elise that if he survived, he would suffocate her with regret. Today, he fulfilled the first step of that promise. The thrill of revenge is far sweeter than he could have imagined when he sees the heir to the formerly noble Mitchell family reduced to serving dishes in a crummy bar. The cell phone rings. It's Mia. Mr. Reynolds, the executives of Mitchell Enterprises are waiting for you in the conference room. They want to understand the new corporate direction. Tell them I'll be there in half an hour, Victor replied, and hung up. He glanced out the window again at the rain. Every step he's taken over the past 2 years has been carefully planned for this moment. He made it. He got back everything that was his and more. But that's just the beginning. The real plan for revenge is just unfolding. Victor caressed the scar on his chest, a sneer emerging on his lips. Elise thinks losing the family business is the worst that can happen. She doesn't yet know what revenge really tastes like. The following week, Victor devoted himself to the complete remodeling of Mitchell Enterprises. With ruthless efficiency, he fires all the executives associated with Alexander, even those in middle management who used to fawn over Elise. Every time he signs a termination notice, Victor feels a sweetness of revenge. He brought in an elite team of people he had trained, reorganized the corporate structure, and axed several legacy divisions of which the Mitchell family was proud. The company's logo was redesigned, retaining only the Mitchell name in an obscure corner, as if to deliberately humiliate the once glorious family. The market reacted positively to these changes, and the share price rose steadily. The original employees of Mitchell Enterprises were trembling in fear that they would be the next to be fired. Victor felt a morbid satisfaction in the aura of power and fear as people looked down to avoid his eyes as he passed in the corridors of the company. Friday night, Victor decided to return to Rusty Anchor. This time, he's not there to see Elise, but to find Alexander. Even though he told Elise that Alexander lived in a subway station, that was only partially true. Victor's private investigator details Alexander's every move, and the report reveals that the depraved man comes to Rusty Anchor every Friday to drink, try to see Elise, and occasionally harass her. A cold smile appeared on Victor's lips. It was time to go head-to-head with the man who had tried to kill him. The bar was even more raucous than last time, and the weekend crowd made the small place seem crowded. Victor chose the same corner seat, ordered a whiskey, and waited. Elise wasn't on tonight's shift, which suited him just fine. He didn't want her to get between him and Alexander. Alexander stumbled into the bar around 10 p.m. His hair was disheveled, his beard scruffy, and his clothes worn and dirty. His once handsome face is now puffy and gaunt from alcohol and street life. He walked straight to the bar and ordered the cheapest beer he could find. Victor looked at the man who had tried to kill him with no hatred in his heart, only a strange pity. Alexander's fall from grace wasn't directly caused by him. It was a consequence of the man's own choices. When faced with a difficult business situation, Alexander chose gambling and alcohol over trying to solve the problem. As Alexander finishes his third beer, Victor walks over to the bar and sits in the chair next to him. "Another drink for the gentleman," Victor said to the bartender before turning to Alexander. "Long time no see, Alexander." Alexander slowly turned his head and narrowed his eyes at Victor. Alcohol and exhaustion dulled his reactions. "Who are you?" he asked vaguely. "Don't you remember me?" Victor asked calmly. "Maybe this will help you remember." He unbuttoned a few buttons of his shirt, revealing the hideous scars on his chest. Alexander's eyes suddenly widened and his face turned pale. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out and he had to grab the bar to support himself. "No way," he whispered. "You should be dead." "I'm sorry to disappoint you," Victor said, rebuttoning his shirt. "Sit down, Alexander. We need to talk." Alexander hesitated, then slowly sat back in his chair. There was fear and confusion in his eyes. "What do you want?" "I want to know the truth," Victor said, signaling the bartender to pour Alexander a full glass of spirits. "Tell me why? Did Elise put you up to this?" Alexander smiled bitterly and shook his head. "Elise doesn't know anything. That's my decision. I hate you, Reynolds. Hate that you took everything from me. Mitchell's trust, the future of the company, even Elise." "I didn't steal Elise," Victor retorted coldly. "She betrayed me and chose you." "No." Alexander took a sip of his spirits and coughed a few times. "She never really chose me. She's just trying to get back at you." "Get back at me for what?" Victor's eyes became dangerous. Alexander said dismally, "You really don't know? That business trip you took in Europe, she found a picture of you with that Frenchwoman. She had a complete breakdown, and I happened to be there." A flash of shock flashed in Victor's eyes. Then he regained his composure. "It was 3 years ago, a misunderstanding. The French woman was the client's wife, and the photo was just a courtesy social group shot, but was apparently misunderstood by." "That's no reason," Victor sneered. "Even if that were true, she could have questioned me. She could have left me, but not betrayed like this." "She tried questioning you," Alexander continued. "But you were always too busy, weren't you? For work, you always have time. For family, you always put it off. She thinks you don't care about her feelings." "That night, in the alley, why did she come?" Victor digresses. "She followed me," Alexander replied. "I got drunk and kept cursing your name. She guessed what I was going to do, but she didn't stop me. She wanted to see you hurt, but I don't think she expected things to go that far. She watched me bleed and didn't immediately call an ambulance," Victor said through gritted teeth. Alexander shrugged. "I fled when the sirens went off, but I saw her walking towards you. Later, she told me you survived, and she looked both relieved and scared. I thought you'd call the police." "There's not enough evidence," Victor sneered. "Besides, Elise chose to take your side." On the surface, Alexander smiled bitterly. But after that she became cold and distant. "She used me to help her control the company, but never let me near her. Whenever I bring up that night, she shakes and leaves the room. When the company started going downhill, she blamed me and eventually abandoned me." "Did you know I bought Mitchell Enterprises?" Victor asked suddenly. Alexander laughed bitterly again. "The entire Boston business community knows that. Reynolds' revenge, that's what they call it. But I guess your revenge plan isn't over yet, is it?" Victor smiled slightly, a smile that made Alexander shiver. "Indeed, Alexander. I'm destroying everything you've got, step by step. Now, tell me every detail about that night. I want the truth, the whole truth." Alexander drained his glass as if drawing courage. He then begins to recount everything about that night, from his and Elise's planning to the details of the attack on Victor to how they falsified evidence to frame Victor afterward. His voice trembled, and his eyes flashed with fear and remorse at times. "So Elise knew about your plan from the beginning." Victor's voice was awfully calm, and even, she encouraged it. Alexander nodded. "She provided your itinerary and told me where you would show up. But I think she's just trying to scare you and make you feel the pain of betrayal, not actually trying to kill you." "But you want to," Victor said, looking Alexander straight in the eye. "Yes, at the time I thought," Alexander admitted. "I hated you." Victor leaned closer to Alexander, his voice low. "You know what? If you just hated me, I might understand. But what you and Elise did, that was a complete betrayal. One tried to kill me, one watched me bleed. Both of you, you should pay." Alexander's face turned even paler. "What do you want?" Victor stood up and towered over the broken man. Continue my revenge. Mitchell Enterprises is just the beginning. I'll make sure that you and Elise never make a comeback. However, in return for your confession, I will give you a choice. He took two papers out of his inner pocket and placed them in front of Alexander. The first is a one-way ticket to Australia and some cash, enough to start your new life over there. The second is a statement detailing how you and Elise plotted to murder me and falsely accuse me of domestic abuse. I've got a lawyer ready to go. Alexander looked at the two documents in horror. What do you want me to do? The choice, Victor said coldly, is either to sign this statement, help me completely destroy the last vestiges of Elise's dignity and reputation, and leave Boston, or continue with the life you're living now, but know that I will make sure that you will never be able to get a steady job and never get out of this life. Alexander picked up the statement with a trembling hand, a struggling look in his eyes. Finally, he whispered, "Give me a pen." He turned away without another glance at Alexander. As I walked out of the bar, the stars in the night sky were bright and clear, like they were witnessing the turn of the moment. Victor drove home with a lot of thoughts. Tonight's conversation had taught him more of the truth, but it had also brought more questions. What exactly is Elise's role in all of this? Did she ever really love him? Does she know about Alexander's plan? Upon arriving home, Victor poured a glass of whiskey and walked to the balcony. His apartment is located in one of Boston's tallest buildings, from which it overlooks the city. At night, Boston is lit up like a starry sky reflected on the ground. He remembered the way Elise had looked at him on their wedding day. At that time, her eyes were full of love and hope. When did everything start to change? Perhaps it's time to face Elise head on, not as an avenger, but as someone seeking answers. But that will be tomorrow. Tonight, he just wanted to be alone, with his memories and thoughts. There's no turning back on the road to revenge, but the road ahead doesn't have to be dominated by hate either. Victor raised his glass to the brightest star in the night sky. To vengeance, he said softly, but more to truth. Alexander's confession has Victor thinking. A week later, he decides to travel to Rusty Anchor again, this time to have a thorough conversation with Elise. Elise was pouring a drink for a customer when Victor walked into the bar on Thursday night. When she saw him come in, her movements visibly paused and the bottle of wine in her hand nearly slipped. But she quickly regained her composure and went back to work, pretending not to see him. Victor chose a corner of the bar and ordered a scotch. He noticed Elise's co-workers whispering to her, glancing in his direction from time to time. Apparently, they know who he is, probably because of his conversation with Alexander last week. As the bar grew quiet, Elise finally walked up to him. "There you go again," she said, sounding even more tired than the last time we saw each other. "Anything else you want to tell me? New name for Mitchell Enterprises? Or how do you plan to split my grandfather's legacy?" Victor shook his head. "I came here to talk, Elise. Real talk." Elise looked at him skeptically. "About what?" "About the truth," Victor replied. "About everything that happened that night. About our marriage. About why you chose to betray." Elise was silent for a moment, then looked at her watch. "My shift ends in 10 minutes. If you really want to talk, wait for me after work." Victor nodded and watched her continue working. He noticed a grace in her movements, even in such a simple task. That was the mark of years of good breeding and status. Even after her fall from grace, Elise still maintains her Mitchell family pride. Half an hour later, Elise changed out of her uniform and walked out in simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair hung loosely over her shoulders, not as carefully groomed as it used to be. "Where are we going to talk?" she asked. "My car is outside," Victor said. "I know a quiet place." Elise hesitated, but eventually followed him out of the bar. Victor's driver was already waiting, and he opened the back door and let Elise get in first. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," said the chauffeur, an old employee who had worked during their marriage. Elise reluctantly nodded and got into the car, with Victor following close behind. "To Riverside, Charles," Victor said to the driver. The two were silent as the car drove through the streets of Boston at night. The banks of the Charles River is where they had their first date and where Victor proposed. This choice was not accidental. When the car pulls up to a quiet corner of the river, Victor motions for Elise to get out of the car with him. The river reflected the lights of the city, and the breeze ruffled the water in tiny ripples. "Remember this place?" Victor asked, looking at the lights across the river. Of course, Elise replied softly. How could I forget? They walked side by side on the path along the river, with hardly anyone else around. The night air was fresh and cool with the scent of early fall. I talked to Alexander. Victor spoke up, and he told me about that night. He said you didn't know his plans. Elise stopped and turned to Victor. Do you trust him? I don't know, Victor replied honestly. That's why I wanted to hear your version. Elise took a deep breath, then kept walking. Alexander and I. She paused as if searching for the right words. That's not love. At least not for me. It was an escape, a revenge. Revenge for what? Victor asked. Revenge for your indifference, your preoccupation with work and neglect of our marriage. At that time, you were at the office all day and we hardly communicated. Victor wanted to retort, but he knew there was some truth to what she was saying. During his last months at Mitchell Enterprises, he did devote himself to his work and neglected his marriage. Alexander gave me attention, gave me the feeling that I was valued, Elise continued. But I never wanted to hurt you, let alone something like that. She stopped and turned to Victor with tears in her eyes. That night, I saw Alexander drunk and cursing your name over and over. I was afraid he'd do something stupid, so I followed him out the door. But I didn't think he'd be carrying a knife. I didn't think he'd. Her voice choked and tears ran down her cheeks. When I saw you lying there, bleeding, I'm freaking out. I want to help you, but I don't know how. Then the sirens went off, and I thought someone had called the police and an ambulance would be here soon. But you still falsely accused me of domestic violence, Victor said coldly. Elise shook her head. That wasn't my idea. It's Alexander. He says you'll retaliate against us unless we strike first. He prepared false evidence and got false witnesses. I was too scared to agree. You're too scared? Victor's voice was full of sarcasm. Scared enough to take away everything I have and then enjoy my accomplishments with the man who tried to kill me? I'm not enjoying it. Elise exclaims, I've been living in fear and guilt. Every night, I dream of you lying in a pool of blood, your eyes fixed on me with accusation. When I heard you survived, I was relieved, but at the same time, I was more afraid. Afraid I'll retaliate. Yes, but it's more than that, Elise said. I'm afraid to face my choices and admit the mistakes I've made. They continued to walk along the banks of the river as the night grew darker around them. The moonlight sprinkled the water like a silver dust. Alexander said you were always in love with me. Victor snapped. Is that true? Elise didn't answer immediately. She looked at the lights in the distance and pondered the question. I don't know what love is, Victor. I thought I knew, but now I'm not so sure. I have feelings for you, even after the betrayal. But is that love? I can't say. Why did you and Alexander break up? Because I finally saw him for what he was, Elise replied. After you left, he became controlling and clueless about the company. He started gambling, drinking, and paying his debts with company money. I tried to stop him, but he became violent. Once, he even hit me. Victor felt a surge of anger come over him, but he suppressed it. And then what? Then I left him, but it was too late. The company had already started to go downhill, with the stock price falling and employees leaving. It got worse after Dad died. No one believes a woman who has falsely accused her husband of domestic violence, especially when her new partner is an alcoholic gambler. The board sidelined me, the shareholders pulled out, and ultimately, I lost control. She stopped and looked over at Victor. You know, in the final stages of your acquisition of the company, I wasn't even told. I learned from the news that my family business had been acquired by a company called Phoenix Ventures. Back then, I didn't know it was you behind it. Victor did not respond to this comment. He led Elise to a bench by the river, and the two sat down. The river breeze was a little cooler at night, and Elise couldn't help but shiver softly. Victor takes off his jacket and hands it to her. Thanks, she whispered, pulling on her jacket. They were silent for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Why did you come back to Boston? Elise eventually asked. Why come back to this city of painful memories when you could start over anywhere? Because I have unfinished business, Victor replied. And because I need to face the past in order to truly move forward. Is that why you bought Mitchell Enterprises? To face the past. Victor shook his head. No, that was to fulfill a promise. I told you once that if I survived, I would suffocate you with regret. Elise lowered her head. You did it. Waking up every day knowing that the family legacy has changed hands and knowing that it's all because of the choices I've made really takes my breath away." Victor looked at the side of her face, her profile still beautiful in the moonlight. He had loved this woman so much that he had once been willing to do everything for her. Right now, he wasn't sure what he was feeling. "Alexander went to the sober living center," he said, "and I gave him an address. He decided to change his life." Elise's eyes widened in shock. "You found Alexander? What did he tell you?" Victor sneered. "Enough of the truth. I know everything, Elise. Your plans, your involvement, your lies. Alexander has admitted it all." He took a document out of his briefcase and pushed it in front of Elise. "This is Alexander's book-faced testimony detailing how you all worked together to plan my murder." He signed it, and it's notarized. Elise picked up the file with a shaky hand and quickly skimmed the contents, her face growing pale. "It's not. Not exactly. Stop lying," Victor snapped. "The facts are clear. You found pictures of me with a female French client, completely misunderstood the situation, and then decided to get back at me. Not only did you betray me, you encouraged Alexander to kill me. And as I lay in a pool of blood, you stood there, looking at me, hesitating to save me. I didn't know he would carry a knife." Elise broke down and cried. "I just wanted you to feel the pain of betrayal. I didn't think he would stab me in the chest." Victor took it coldly. "What a convenient excuse. Then why didn't you call an ambulance immediately? Why did you falsely accuse me of domestic violence afterward? Why did you take everything from me?" Elise was speechless and could only bow her head and cry. "Now listen," Victor's voice was as cold as ice. "I bought Mitchell Enterprises and took away the last thing you had to fall back on. Alexander has signed the deposition and will leave Boston. Now it's your turn. What do you want?" Elise asked shakily. Victor removed another document from his briefcase. "This is an agreement. By signing it, you're admitting to falsely accusing me of domestic abuse and admitting your involvement in a murderous scheme. I won't publicize it right away unless you try to resurface. In the meantime, you must leave Boston forever and not contact anyone associated with Mitchell Enterprises or me." "So where am I supposed to go?" "Do what?" Elise asked desperately. "That's not my problem," Victor replied coolly. "You have a week to think about it. Sign and leave, or I'll turn the papers over to the police and the press so that you not only lose your wealth and status, but your freedom as well." He stood up and looked condescendingly at the woman who had been his wife. "1 week, Elise. Don't test my patience." With that said, he turned and left without looking back at her again. A month later, Victor stood in his office on the top floor of the Reynolds building, overlooking a panoramic view of Boston. His plan for revenge was accomplished more smoothly than expected. Mitchell Enterprises has been fully integrated into the Reynolds Group. The share price is at record highs, and the market is raving about his leadership. The door to the private elevator opens, and Mia walks in, a file in her hand. "Mr. Reynolds, the latest quarterly report. We are 15% above expectations. Also, Elise Mitchell has officially left Boston, and she's gone to a small town in Arizona." Victor smiled slightly. "Very well. Where's Alexander?" "He's settled in Australia, and, according to our sources, he's got a job with a small company and is living a low-key life." "Perfect," Victor said, taking the report. "Make sure our people keep watching them. If any of them try to contact the media or return to Boston, I want to know immediately." "Of course, sir," Mia nodded. "There's one more thing. The board of directors recommended that we completely remove the Mitchell name and completely rebrand the business as the Reynolds Group. They thought keeping the Mitchell name would remind people of the old management." Victor thought for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "Tell them they can proceed. It's time to erase the Mitchell family legacy altogether." After Mia leaves, Victor walks over to the window and looks out at the Boston skyline. Once, part of the city belonged to the Mitchell family. Now, it belongs to him, Victor Reynolds. He caressed the scar on his chest, recalling every step of the last 2 years. From a dying alley to the top of a business empire, his plan for revenge is flawless. The Mitchell family legacy is completely destroyed. Elise and Alexander are banished from Boston, and he, a man once falsely accused and betrayed, now stands at the top of the food chain. Victor picks up the picture frame on his desk, which contains an old photo of him and Elise on the banks of the Charles River, a wonderful time during their relationship. He took one last look at the photo, then tossed it into the shredder. This is the price of betrayal, he said to himself, watching the photographs being torn to pieces. This is my revenge. Outside the window, the Boston sky began to rain, just like that fateful night. But this time, Victor isn't the prey lying in a pool of blood, he's the victor towering over him. He smiled, feeling the cold satisfaction of revenge. This is what he deserves. This is what betrayers deserve. There is no forgiveness, no reconciliation, only just revenge. That's the end of today's story. For more captivating tales, hit subscribe and never miss an episode.